Thank you so much for being here with us, Madam Managing Director. We're so pleased that you could join us for Reuters Next. There is a huge amount of turmoil in the world right now, not least because of the emergence of this new COVID-19 variant. What are the implications for the global economic outlook from your point of view?
Even before the arrival of this new variant, we were concerned that the recovery, while it continues, is losing somewhat momentum. Why? Because of slowdown in the two countries that are engines for growth in the US and in China. And because the Delta variant proved to be a disruptance, it caused some additional delays in production. So let's be very frank, a new variant that may spread very rapidly can dent confidence, and in that sense we are likely to see some downgrades of our October projections for global growth. And what we are also focusing on is, at the same time, problems already in place are deepening. Divergence between countries recovering faster and those falling behind is more entrenched, and new problems are stepping forward for policymakers, and in particular inflation and debt.
Yes, so inflation pressures, since you mentioned them, are mounting. Consumer price increases hit a 31-year high in the United States in October. In today's blog, the IMF said it would be appropriate for the Federal Reserve to accelerate the taper of asset purchases and move forward toward rate increases. How soon does that have to happen from your point of view?
Well, the blog says three things, and I want to put the whole messaging so we can talk about the US in that context. It says appropriately that the picture on inflation is diverse. Very different circumstances in different countries. In the US, action has to be taken, whereas Japan is well below their target for inflation, and Europe is somewhere in between. Secondly, it does flag that the Fed is now in a place where, as Chair Powell said, slowing down asset purchases, withdrawing from asset purchases is necessary. And yes, we do believe that the path to policy rate increases may be walked faster. We were thinking before 23, now this may be 22. And that takes me to the third message from the blog, very important for our membership, very important for the fund. For countries with high leverage, especially dollar-denominated debt, any advancements on this path of policy rate increases would be very significant pressure on servicing their debt obligations. So yes, the US, for a very good reason, the US economy is doing well. Demand is pushing prices up with supply disruptions continuing, does have to take these actions for the sake of sustaining a prudent macroeconomic and financial stability. As the US does it, so important to communicate well in advance so there are no surprises. And if I may end on a somewhat more positive note, Andrea, what drives that inflation pressure in the US partially is the good performance of the economy. Good performance of the US economy also has spillover impact on the rest of the world, and this time they are positive impacts.
You know, we've talked about inflation in the context of interest rate increases, but the US government is working really hard, pulling on every lever available to try to tackle inflation. Working on supply chain disruptions that have proven to last longer than expected. One thing that hasn't really been done yet is the area of tariffs and tariff reductions. So would you recommend, from a macroeconomic point of view, that tariff reductions would be a useful tool?
They certainly are a useful tool, and we see the U.S. Trade Representative engaging on this topic, and U.S. looking into a possible ease coming from tariff reductions. It is not a silver bullet. There has to be action on all these fronts so we can see the issue of inflation being contained. And if I may add, when we talk about supply chain interruptions, we should always remember the very best way to reduce these interruptions is vaccinate the world, put more obstacles on the way of these disruptions because we are protecting more of the world's population against COVID.
Now, you mentioned the tariff exclusion process that Catherine Tai is working her way through. That is for a relatively limited number of items. Mm-hmm. Would there be utility in looking at the much larger $200 billion worth of tariffs imposed by the Trump administration as a sort of second tariff? Makes sense just from a global point of view, if nothing else.
Again, this is why I said what is being taken into account is relatively small. It would have a positive impact. Every single measure counts. And of course, the more our measures in this time when the uncertainty for the global economy unfortunately has increased, the more it is done to boost the prospects for growth in the United States, the economy, the better.
Are you encouraged by the summit conversation between President Biden and President Xi several weeks ago and the kind of, agreement to work together a little bit more productively?
Of course, this is a very positive sign. The concentration of all of us has to be on coming out of this crisis. We are in together. We can only come out of it together. That goes for vaccinations. It goes for supporting the most vulnerable parts of the world to cope with the crisis. It goes on, at the same time, accelerating action to face this other crisis, the climate crisis, together. So indeed, that was a very positive signal coming from that summit.
You wrote a blog this week about debt and the debt problems and the problems with the common framework that was established by the G20 and the Paris Club to deal with the huge debt problems facing the global developing countries and emerging economies, but not just those countries. Why is it proving so difficult to move forward on these issues?
The reality is 2022 is going to be a very pressing year in terms of dealing with debt. Why? Debt levels have gone up much more than during the global financial crisis. We see sovereign debt up 18%. If we are to project bringing the debt burden down, it would take decades to go to pre-pandemic levels unless we have a much more thoughtful and aggressive policy. Who is at highest risk? Of course, countries that entered the pandemic already in debt distress and had to borrow justifiably to deal with the consequences of it. So far, interest rates are relatively low. This is not so dramatic. Going forward from the conversation on inflation, that may not be the case through 2022. And in that case, it is so very important to front the debt issue now, not wait until the dominoes start falling. Why is the common framework both important and difficult? Very important because it brings a much broader set of creditors, the G20 and private sector creditors around the table. Why it is difficult? Because it is much more complicated when you have different interests, and especially when these are some creditors that don't have a tradition of multilateral action. Mm-hmm. What is it that the fund is arguing for? Three things. One, we have 3 countries that ask for this framework: Ethiopia, Zambia, Chad. Get it done. Chad, we are making good progress. Zambia, we are making fantastic progress with a very reform-minded government. We have to help them to restructure that. Ethiopia, when conditions from a security standpoint improve, we have to move. So get those done. Example for others to follow. 2, take lessons. What is it that is not working so well? Fix it. What is it not working so well? Timeliness. The composition of creditor committees, meetings, takes time. We have to have an agreed time schedule and stick to it. Lack of incentive for countries to participate. Why would they participate if that takes forever and during that time they are still expected to service debt? We are proposing a very prudent step, which is debt service stands still for countries stepping into the framework. The moment you ask, you don't service your debt, and it is restructured in a timely manner. And bringing everybody on board means for the fund, for the World Bank, we work very closely together on that, to do everything we can to bring the members of this framework into a collaborative action. I have engaged most recently with both private sector in the Chad situation and with China as a large creditor. And my message to everybody is don't wait until it is too late. It would be costlier for you. It would be very painful for the countries. Move.
So do you see that the agreement by Glencore to get involved in the Chad case is a positive signal and could kind of lead the way for other private sector creditors to get involved, or is that just such a special case that it won't be precedent setting? Every
single case will have to be addressed on its own. But the stepping forward by Glencore is positive. It shows that they're doing it because it is the right thing to do, but they're also doing it from the position of enlightened self-interest. If we don't help Chad to step on its feet, it's not going to be very good for Glencore. And that is the tough part when you have multiple parties, for each and every one of them to see their enlightened self-interest in moving together. We have a big role to play. That sustainability analysis by the fund, very important, but also engaging with this community of lenders and engaging with the debtor countries, working relentlessly towards successful outcome.
Sure. Now, you did sign an agreement, or there's a staff-level agreement with Zambia that was just announced this morning. Does that send a signal that you're moving forward to other countries that maybe have not yet asked for treatment under the common framework? And how many countries do you expect could come forward once this kind of knot gets undone?
So on the issue of Zambia, I am so excited by the progress we have made with Zambia in a short period of time. I just got off the phone with the president of Zambia. Very strong reform program put in place, unity of purpose in the government, and determination from their side. When we have a situation like this of reform-minded government proving that their intentions are sound, it is critical to move fast to support them. And yes, we would like to see Zambia, for the sake of the people of Zambia, reaching that resolution and having a successful program with the fund. We are still to sign a program with Zambia. But we also see that as a signal to those countries that are sitting on the bench, not sure whether they should move towards the common framework to do so. How many? I can only tell you that 60% are in a situation of debt distress or close to debt distress of the low-income countries. Doesn't mean that they all need common framework treatment, but the number is certainly much bigger than 3. And also, we are
talking a dozen?
I would expect that if we are successful to reform the common framework, this would be not an unlikely number to talk about a dozen countries or even more. But I mean, I don't want to prejudge where we would be. What I do want to say, though, Andrea, is that we're talking about low-income countries. Common framework is only for them. Should it be only for them? Should we think about middle-income countries with tremendous debt service obligations and how we can approach these countries' issues in a more prudent, structured, and organized way?
So what is the main impediment to increasing and expanding the universe of countries that could be included? The United States has said it supports expanding the framework to include bigger, other countries that might be vulnerable.
It is the lack of experience of some of the creditors in operating in multilateral setting. We also do have to show that it is in everybody's interest. And I do believe that as we make progress on these first cases, and especially as we engage with the bilateral creditors with less experience in that area, we would then make progress in more willingness to expand the universe of who is eligible for this treatment.
This weekend, IMF officials will be meeting with Argentine officials. This process has been going on for 2 years. How soon do you think you can get to some agreement, and what have you agreed upon?
What we have achieved so far is a common understanding of the importance of working towards a program that significantly improves the macroeconomic fundamentals of Argentina and puts Argentina on a sound path to recover from this crisis. A program that, as President Fernandez flagged after the elections, benefits from broad societal and political support. We have worked so far constructively, but there's a lot to be done. So we stay engaged, we work out together towards a program, and we are ready when we are ready.
Is there a risk that fund demands could basically either push your largest debtor into default or, see Argentines hit the streets in protest?
We are very well defined in our objective, and it is to help the people of Argentina deal with problems that Argentina currently is facing. We have very good understanding that these problems range from inflation to not sufficiently strong private sector participation in the pursuit of growth, to poverty. 40% of the people of Argentina are poor. So we are thinking of a program that is balanced in addressing these problems Argentina faces, and a program that is owned by Argentina. It is not a program of the fund. It is only a program that Argentina broadly supports and owns that is likely to be successful.
Another big concern for you is climate change. I know that because we saw each other at the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow. Critics say the IMF should stick to its knitting, to its core mission, and not be delving into all this climate. Why is that? Why is it that the IMF has a role to play?
We are sticking to our knitting. What is our knitting? Macroeconomic and financial stability, growth and employment, issues that are squarely macrocritical. I don't think there are many people today who see climate change as not being macrocritical for stability, growth, and employment. It is. And the reason the IMF is engaged on this topic is because for our members it matters. We got very strong support from the membership to engage on climate issues in the areas of our competitive strength. What are they? One, policy assessment, the surveillance function we have, putting a hand on the pulse of national economies and seeing how they are at risk from climate, how they can from addressing these risks, how they can underpin a just transition. Two, financial stability. Already the finance community, central banks and private finance recognize that climate shocks are a risk and the transition to low carbon, climate resilient future could be a risk. We are the institution that invented stress testing, and we are being called to help to stress test against these climate risks, to help with data. And this is the third area where the fund is so strong. Include climate data in macroeconomic data. So decision makers can embrace managing their risks, capturing opportunities of transition. Last but not least, financing. As you know, Andrea, we are on our way to create a new instrument for the fund, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Huge support from the membership for it, and it would add to the many instruments that we are putting in place in what is going to be the most significant transformation of our economies in our lifetimes.
So how soon will we see climate stress tests included, and when will this RST start working? I mean, I know you've gotten some pledges already, or at least notional pledges, right?
We are already incorporating climate in our financial sector assessments. And our determination is to make that mainstream. And as we are working on that, we are working on how stress testing for climate-related risks can be integrated. We expect to have within this year, next year, 2022, to have piloting of how this is being done. But let me remind you that other institutions are also working on this topic. Sure. We are one of the partners, and we are doing our best to help. On the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, our pledge to the membership is by the spring meetings to have the design in place, and by the annual meetings to have it in action.
Okay. You know, the World Bank and the IMF have a big role to play, perhaps also in terms of climate finance. World Bank, the other multilateral banks. How well prepared are they to take on what will be trillions and trillions of dollars of funding that is required?
Yeah. Well, let me first praise the World Bank and the multilateral development banks for stepping up. They all have significantly increased their financing for mitigation, adaptation, and transition. This being said, we need not billions, we need trillions. Our assessment is between 6 and 10 trillions for mitigation action in this decade, about 6 trillion. This is UNEP's assessment for adaptation in this decade. So how can you get from billions to trillions? The most important role they can play, and actually we at the IMF can play, is create the conditions for private finance on scale to go into emerging markets and developing economies. What does that mean? It means to find ways to reduce risk for private finance, to improve the quality of data. This is why we invest a lot in data at the fund, to have trust that green is actually green and not beige. And that is work that the multilateral development banks and the IMF, this world, is destined to undertake, so we can see the transformation happening in advanced economies and in emerging markets and developing economies at the same time. And by the way, the more we do as institutions that are inclusive, the more trust there would be built across the globe between advanced economies and the rest of the world.
The IMF board gave you its full support in September after a report that had raised questions about data irregularities at the World Bank, and so I'm wondering, though, at that point, the Treasury said, yes, we are supportive here, but we would like to see an action program. What have you done to complete that action program? And when will it be finished?
Let me first say that I'm very grateful to the board of the IMF. They spent hours and hours and hours to thoroughly review what was in front of them, and on that basis, they gave me full support. They also said, look, whenever we have a moment like this, the fund is fantastic. We are the best institution on research and data. It's recognized. But can you do even better? And so we embraced on a program that looks into, are there areas where, in the spirit of what the fund has been fantastic for way before me and will be after me, of continuous improvements, what can more be done? What are we looking at? We are looking at independent evaluations that have been done. For example, one of them says, you fund, you tend to be a bit more optimistic in growth projections for program countries. Is there something more that can be done? And looking at all the processes, are they sufficiently up to date with what others are doing? And I can tell you, I'm very proud that I'm at the fund at this time, because what is ahead of us is going to be a year, maybe years. And the fund has to be the best it can be for the membership.
Terrific. I think we need to wrap up. We're going to thank you so much for being with us, for joining us at Reuters Next, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much, Andrea.
Thank you.